She's not family. She's just the maid. 6 words. That's all it took for my own son to erase me in front of 200 strangers. I stood there in my best navy dress, holding a small wrapped gift, and for a moment I genuinely thought I'd misheard him. The room went quiet enough to hear ice clinking in someone's glass. Then his fiancée turned around, looked straight at my face, and gasped, not from embarrassment, but from recognition. "Wait," she said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "I know you." Before you keep watching, hit subscribe because what happens in the next 10 minutes will completely change how you see the people closest to you. My name is Carol Whitfield. I'm 61 years old, and until that night, I thought I understood my son completely. I was wrong. And what came out over the next hour in that ballroom is something nobody, including me, saw coming. Stay until the end, because the final twist will leave you speechless. Let me take you back to the beginning because you need to understand exactly what I gave up to raise that boy. I had Marcus when I was 22 in a small apartment outside Tulsa, Oklahoma. His father left before Marcus turned 5, and from that day forward it was just the two of us against everything. I worked 2 jobs for most of his childhood, days at a dental office answering phones, evenings cleaning houses for families who could afford someone like me. I never hid that second job from him. He used to ride along sometimes, doing homework in the back seat of my old Corolla while I scrubbed someone else's kitchen floor on my knees. Comment below if you've ever sacrificed something huge for someone you loved, because what I'm about to tell you might make you question whether it was worth it. He knew exactly what I did to keep food on the table, and for years he was proud of it. In middle school, Marcus told his teacher, proudly, in front of the whole class, "My mom cleans houses, and she's the hardest worker I know." I held on to that memory for nearly 2 decades. It was proof that whatever struggles we had, he respected me, that he saw the sacrifice for what it was instead of something shameful. I never imagined that years later, that same boy would stand in a hotel ballroom and erase that history in a single sentence in front of the one woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. But here's the question I need you to sit with as this story unfolds. How does a child go from defending his mother proudly at 11 years old to denying her existence at 28? The answer is more disturbing than you'd think, and it has everything to do with what happened next. Keep watching, because the moment his fiancée recognized me changed the entire trajectory of that night. Marcus grew up fast after that. Scholarship to a state university, then law school on loans, and pure grit. I was proud beyond words. When he landed his first associate position at a firm in Dallas, I cried on the phone with him for 10 straight minutes. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. The calls got shorter. The visits got rarer. He started mentioning people from a different world, clients, partners, people with last names that opened doors I'd never even seen. I told myself it was normal. Successful people get busy. He wasn't ashamed, just stretched thin. I want you to remember that excuse, because I'm going to come back to it later in the story, and you're going to realize just how wrong I was to believe it. When he called to tell me he was engaged to a woman named Vanessa Caldwell, I was thrilled. I had no idea that engagement would expose every lie my son had been quietly building for years. Marcus told me Vanessa came from a prominent family in Dallas, that her father owned a chain of boutique hotels across Texas. He invited me to the engagement party, told me to dress nice, and texted me an address downtown. He never once told me what he planned to say about me once I walked through those doors. I had no idea I was walking straight into a trap built entirely from his own embarrassment. If you've ever felt like someone you loved was hiding you from a part of their life, you already know that sick feeling in your stomach before you even know why. I felt it the second I stepped out of my car that night, dressed in the nicest thing I owned, more nervous and excited than I'd been in years. I wanted Vanessa's family to like me. I wanted my son to be proud to introduce me. What I got instead, I never could have prepared for. I drove 3 hours from Tulsa in a pale blue dress I'd bought specifically for that night. I brought a gift, a handwritten card, and more hope than I'd felt in a long time. When I walked into that ballroom, chandeliers overhead, white tablecloths, a string quartet playing softly in the corner, I felt out of place immediately. but I pushed the feeling down the way mothers do. I found Marcus near the head table, laughing with a group of men in expensive suits, the kind of laugh that belongs to a man who's finally arrived somewhere he's always wanted to be. I walked over, smiling, ready to hug my son for the first time in months. He turned. He saw me. And for one split second, his face changed completely. A flicker I didn't recognize. I'm going to describe that look to you in detail in the next part because once you understand what it meant, this entire story changes. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't even embarrassment exactly. It was panic, the kind of panic that comes from being caught between two versions of your life colliding in real time. Before I could say a word, one of the men beside him gestured toward me and asked, casually, "And who's this?" Marcus hesitated. 1 second.
2.
Long enough for my stomach to drop straight through the floor. Then he said it. "She's not family. She's just the maid." If you're a parent watching this right now, I want you to imagine hearing those exact words from your own child's mouth, in public, with zero hesitation in his decision to say them. A few people near us chuckled awkwardly, unsure if it was supposed to be a joke. He didn't correct himself. He simply turned back to his conversation, like he hadn't just denied his own mother existed. I stood there frozen. And that's when everything changed. I actually took a physical step back, as if my body understood the betrayal before my mind could fully process it. I thought about every double shift, every secondhand uniform, every night I stayed up making sure his homework was finished even though I'd never finished my own schooling. I thought about the pride in his 11-year-old voice telling his teacher what I did for a living. Somewhere between that classroom and this ballroom, my son had decided I was something to be hidden, something embarrassing to explain away. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply stood there holding a small wrapped gift like an idiot, while 200 strangers watched my own son discard me in real time. And that's when I noticed her. A woman in a deep red dress near the head table, slowly turning around, her expression shifting from polite curiosity to something else entirely. Something that looked, unmistakably, like shock. That was Vanessa, Marcus's fiancée. The woman I'd been told came from money, from a family that owned hotels across the entire state of Texas. She was staring at me like she'd seen a ghost rise up in the middle of her own engagement party. "Wait," she said, her voice cutting clean through the low chatter of the room. "I know you." Marcus turned, confused, his easy smile faltering for the first time all evening. "What do you mean you know her?" he asked, half laughing, clearly hoping this was some kind of misunderstanding that would resolve itself quickly and quietly. I want you to pay close attention here because this is the exact moment the entire night flipped. Vanessa didn't answer him immediately. She kept staring at me, studying my face like she was trying to connect a memory buried years deep. And then, in front of everyone, it clicked. "You used to clean my grandmother's house," Vanessa said slowly. "In Highland Park. Years ago. You took care of her after her stroke." The room went silent again, but this silence had a completely different weight than before. This wasn't the silence of awkward embarrassment. This was the silence of something unraveling. I nodded slowly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Eleanor Caldwell," I said.
"Yes."
"I worked for her for almost 3 years." Vanessa's hand went straight to her chest. If you've ever watched someone realize they've been deceived in real time, you know exactly what her face looked like in that moment. She turned slowly to Marcus, and I could see something hardening behind her eyes. What she said next is going to completely shift the power in that room, and I need you to stick around for it, because it's the moment everyone present finally understood exactly what kind of man my son had become. "She talked about you all the time," Vanessa continued, looking at me with something close to awe. "She told my whole family how kind you were to her, how patient, how you used to read to her in the afternoons after her stroke when she couldn't hold a book steady on her own. She said you were one of the only people who ever treated her like a person and not a patient." Marcus stood frozen, looking back and forth between us, the color slowly draining from his face. He had just called me the maid, in a tone dripping with quiet contempt, never knowing that the very family he was marrying into held that profession, held me, specifically, in a completely different regard entirely. Vanessa turned to him, her expression hardening into something cold and unfamiliar. "Marcus," she said slowly, "is this your mother?" The question hung in the air like a held breath nobody in that room dared release. "Marcus," Vanessa repeated, sharper this time, every syllable cutting. "Is this your mother?" He looked at me, then at the crowd of colleagues and Vanessa's family watching this entire exchange unfold in real time, then back at Vanessa. For one strange second, I actually felt sorry for him, trapped between the truth and an image he'd spent years carefully constructing brick by brick. Finally, quietly, almost inaudibly, he said, "Yes." One word. No apology attached. No explanation offered. Just a confirmation, delivered like a man admitting to a minor scheduling inconvenience rather than acknowledging the woman who raised him completely alone. I want you to remember this moment because the next thing that happened is the part nobody at that party expected, including me. Vanessa's father, a tall silver-haired man I would soon learn owned that entire hotel empire, stepped forward from the crowd with a look on his face I'll never forget. He looked at Marcus with an expression I can only describe as deep, genuine disappointment. "You told us your mother passed away years ago," he said, his voice calm but absolutely unmistakable. The room, somehow, got even quieter than before. I felt my own breath catch hard in my chest. I had no idea, until that exact moment, that Marcus had told people I was dead. Sit with that for a second the way I had to. My son hadn't just been embarrassed of me in passing. He had constructed an entire false history specifically to erase me from his life permanently. Easier, apparently, to mourn a dead mother than to explain a living one who once cleaned houses for a living. If you think that's the worst part of the story, trust me, it's only the beginning. What Vanessa says next reveals exactly how deep this lie went, and it's going to make you furious. Vanessa looked at Marcus with something between heartbreak and disgust. "You told me your mother died when you were in law school," she said, her voice shaking now. "You said it was why you were so close with your aunt." I had no idea which aunt he meant. I have no sister. There was never an aunt. My son had built an entire fictional family history, brick by brick, lie by lie, simply to bury the truth of exactly where he came from. Marcus opened his mouth to explain himself, but nothing came out. For the first time since I'd known him, my own son looked completely, utterly out of words. Vanessa's father turned to me then, his expression softening considerably, almost protectively. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said gently, "would you mind if we spoke privately for a moment?" Before I could even answer him, someone else's voice cut through the room, and it belonged to the one person I least expected to speak up. It was Marcus, finally finding his voice. "Mom, can we talk outside? Please." The word, "Mom," landed strangely after everything that had just happened, like he was reaching for it only now that the lie had fully collapsed around him in public. I looked at him for a long moment, and 26 years of memories flooded through my mind in just a few seconds. The swing set I built him myself, the nights I sat by his bed when he had the flu, the graduation I drove 3 hours to attend after working a double shift the night before. None of it had been enough to earn an honest introduction in front of his future wife's entire family. If you've ever given everything to someone only to be hidden away when it became inconvenient, comment below, because I promise you're not alone. "No," I said quietly. "Everyone here deserves to hear what you have to say, since you already decided to lie to all of them about who I am." His face went completely pale. Vanessa stepped closer to me, gently placing her hand on my arm, an act of unexpected kindness that nearly broke me after the cruelty I'd just absorbed in front of 200 witnesses. "Please," she said, looking directly at me, ignoring Marcus entirely now. "Tell us. All of it." So I did. I told that entire room, calmly, without exaggeration or theatrics, exactly who I was. A single mother who raised her son on a receptionist's salary and a second job cleaning houses, including, as it turned out, the home of the very family he was about to marry into. I told them about the scholarships he earned, the law school loans I co-signed despite barely qualifying myself, the years I drove 3 hours each way just to see him during holidays because he was always too busy to come home. I didn't raise my voice once. I just told the truth. And the room felt it. I didn't cry, though it took everything in me not to. I simply laid it all out, plainly, while my son stood there absorbing the full weight of what he'd done, not just that night, but for years, quietly, methodically erasing me from the story of his own success like I was an inconvenient footnote. When I finished talking, the room was completely silent. Vanessa's father looked at Marcus with an expression that made it painfully clear exactly what he now thought of the young lawyer his daughter had chosen to marry. What he said next is something I'll remember for the rest of my life, and if you've ever wondered what real accountability sounds like coming from someone who has no reason to protect you, you're about to hear exactly that in the next part of this story. Don't skip ahead, because this is the turning point that decided everything that came after that night. Marcus, Vanessa's father said, his voice level but absolutely firm. I built my company from nothing. My own mother cleaned hotel rooms for the very chain I now own. I don't care what someone's job is. I care about whether they raised an honest person. Right now, I'm not sure you qualify. The words landed in that room like a verdict nobody could appeal. Marcus's colleagues, the same men who had been laughing alongside him minutes earlier, suddenly found other places to look. The ceiling, their drinks, anywhere but his face. Vanessa stood beside me now, still holding my arm, her loyalty shifting visibly in real time from the man she'd planned to marry to the mother he had tried so hard to erase. I need a minute, she said quietly, stepping back from Marcus entirely. He reached for her hand. She pulled it away, without hesitation. I watched my son's carefully built world begin to crack in front of 200 witnesses. I watched it happen in slow motion. The prestigious firm, the wealthy fiancé, the entire version of himself he'd constructed at my expense, beginning to collapse right there on that ballroom floor. And honestly, for the first time that night, I wasn't sure if I wanted to comfort him or simply let him sit in the consequences of his own choices. If you were in my position right now, what would you do? Let me know in the comments, because I genuinely want to know, and what I decided to do next surprised even me. Vanessa asked the band to pause and quietly informed the venue staff that the formal toasts would be postponed indefinitely. People began filtering toward the exits, murmuring to each other in that low, charged tone that only happens after something unforgettable occurs in public. I stood near the edge of the room, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the 3-hour drive that got me there. Marcus approached me again, this time without an audience watching us. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of everything that had just happened. You didn't mean what exactly?" I asked him calmly. "To call me the maid? To tell your fiancé I was dead? Which part exactly didn't you mean, Marcus?" He had no answer for me. Standing there, I realized something important. This wasn't really about one cruel sentence at a party. This was about years of quiet shame he'd never had the courage to address honestly, choosing instead to bury it under lies that eventually grew far too large for him to control. Vanessa reappeared beside us then, her eyes red but her voice surprisingly steady. "I think we need to talk," she said to him. "All three of us. Right now. What happened in that private conversation is something I never expected, and it's about to expose even more than I thought possible." We moved to a smaller side room off the main ballroom, away from curious eyes and listening ears. Vanessa sat across from Marcus, arms crossed tightly, while I remained standing near the door, genuinely unsure if I even wanted to be part of this conversation anymore. "Why would you lie about her being dead?" Vanessa asked him directly, no softness left in her voice at all. Marcus rubbed his hands over his face slowly. "Because every time I talked about my childhood, people asked questions," he said. "About money. About where I came from. I got tired of explaining it. It was easier to just not have to." "Easier for who?" Vanessa shot back instantly. "Because it clearly wasn't easier for her." She gestured toward me, without even looking away from him. I stayed quiet, watching my own son try to justify years of erasure with a few clumsy, half-formed sentences. Nothing he said made any of it better. If anything, every explanation he offered revealed a deeper layer of shame he'd never properly dealt with, Shame he'd allowed to curdle into something that ultimately hurt the one person who had never once been ashamed of him a single day in his life. Vanessa turned to me directly. "I'm so sorry," she said. "For all of it. Tonight, and clearly for a long time before tonight, too." I shook my head gently. "You don't owe me an apology," I told her. "He does." Marcus finally looked at me directly then, his eyes wet, his composure completely gone for the first time all evening. "Mom, I'm sorry," he said. "I got caught up trying to be someone in this world, and somewhere along the way I decided you didn't fit into that picture. That was wrong. I know that now." I wanted so badly to believe him in that moment. Part of me actually did. But 26 years of sacrifice doesn't repair itself with one apology. "I appreciate you saying that," I told him honestly. "But I'm not sure an apology forced out of you in a side room means the same thing as one you would have offered without an entire audience pushing you toward it." Vanessa nodded slowly beside me, as if she'd been thinking the exact same thing, watching the man she thought she knew reveal a completely different side of himself she clearly hadn't seen before that night. If you've ever received an apology that felt forced rather than genuine, you already understand exactly why I couldn't fully accept his in that moment. The party never really recovered after that. Most of the guests had already quietly left by the time Vanessa's father came to find us, his expression calmer now, but still undeniably serious. What he offered me next was something I never expected from a man I'd only just met that night, and it caught me completely off guard. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I owe you an apology, too, for the way this entire evening unfolded under my roof." I told him, honestly, that he had absolutely nothing to apologize for. None of this was his doing. He insisted on having his driver take me to a hotel rather than letting me drive 3 hours back to Tulsa that same night, exhausted and emotionally wrung out from everything that had just happened. I accepted, mostly because I genuinely didn't trust myself behind the wheel after a night like that one. As I made my way toward the entrance, Vanessa caught up to me, slightly out of breath. "I don't know what's going to happen with the wedding," she admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I wanted you to know, whatever happens between Marcus and me, I'd still love to get to know you. Properly. Without any of this." Her words meant more to me in that moment than she probably realized. The drive to the hotel gave me time to really think about everything that had just unfolded. I wasn't angry in the loud, dramatic way you might expect from a story like this. I was tired, the kind of tired that comes from finally understanding something you've been avoiding for years without even realizing it. I had spent so long making excuses for Marcus's growing distance. He's busy, he's building a career, successful people get caught up in their own lives, that I'd never let myself consider the simpler, harder truth sitting right in front of me.
He was ashamed of me.
Not because of anything I had ever done wrong, but because of what I represented in a world he was so desperate to belong to. If you've ever made excuses for someone you loved instead of facing an uncomfortable truth, you already know exactly how heavy that realization felt sitting in the back of a stranger's car that night. That realization didn't make me hate my son, but it did do something else, something maybe even more important than anger ever could. It made me stop excusing him entirely. For years I had quietly absorbed his absence, his shortened phone calls, his vague explanations, because I told myself that's simply what unconditional love looked like in practice. That night, sitting in the back of a stranger's car, I finally started to understand something crucial. Unconditional love doesn't mean unconditional silence about being hurt by the person you love most. It doesn't mean accepting cruelty quietly just because the cruelty comes from your own child. I want you to remember that distinction, because it's about to matter a lot more in the next part of the story, when Marcus calls me the very next morning hoping for something I wasn't entirely sure I was ready to give him just yet. Marcus called me the next morning. I let it go to voicemail twice before finally answering on the third attempt, my hand actually shaking slightly as I picked up the phone. "Mom," he said, his voice rough, like he hadn't slept a single hour all night. "Can we talk? Really talk, not like last night." I agreed, hesitantly, to meet him for coffee before heading back home to Tulsa. We sat across from each other in a quiet corner booth, and for the first time in years, he actually talked openly about the shame he'd carried since law school, Watching his classmates casually mention vacation homes and family connections while he hid the fact that his mother cleaned houses just to help pay his tuition bills. What he admitted next genuinely surprised me, and it explained something about that lie I'd been wondering about ever since Vanessa's father said it out loud in front of everyone. He admitted the lie about my death had started small, an offhand comment to avoid an awkward conversation at a networking event years earlier, and had simply never stopped growing once he realized exactly how much easier people treated him when they believed he came from nothing but had transcended it entirely on his own. Each retelling made the lie a little easier to repeat, a little more convincing, until eventually it stopped feeling like a lie at all and started feeling like the truth he'd chosen to live inside. I sat there absorbing all of it, watching my own son slowly unravel years of careful self-deception across a small coffee table. If you've ever watched someone you love finally admit something they've hidden for years, you know that strange mixture of relief and heartbreak that comes with it. What I said to him next is something I needed him to hear clearly, and I think you need to hear it too. I didn't clean houses so you could be embarrassed of me once you didn't have to anymore, I told him, my voice steady despite everything. I did it so you'd have choices I never had. The whole point was for you to build a better life. It was never meant to mean erasing the one that came before it. He sat with that for a long moment, tears welling in his eyes, finally beginning to understand the difference between building a future for yourself and burying the past that made that future possible in the first place. We didn't fix everything over one cup of coffee, of course. Trust like that doesn't rebuild itself in a single conversation, no matter how honest. But it was a start, an honest one. The first real conversation we'd had in years that wasn't filtered through guilt, distance, or carefully managed half-truths. What happened with Vanessa next, though, is something I genuinely didn't see coming. As for the wedding, Vanessa postponed it indefinitely, telling Marcus directly that she needed to see real, consistent change before she could ever trust the foundation they were supposedly building a marriage on. I respected her for that more than I could ever fully express to her face. It would have been easy for her to ignore everything that happened, to chalk it up to one bad night and move forward as if nothing had been revealed. Instead, she chose accountability over comfort, which is far rarer than most people realize. If you've ever had to choose between comfort and truth in a relationship, you know exactly how difficult that choice really is. Over the following weeks, something interesting started happening that none of us expected. Vanessa began reaching out to me directly, separate from Marcus entirely, and what started as polite check-ins slowly turned into something I never anticipated forming out of that disastrous night. Vanessa texted me one Tuesday afternoon, almost shyly, asking if I'd want to grab lunch sometime, just the two of us. I'll admit, I hesitated before responding. Part of me wondered if it would be strange, even disloyal to my son, to build a relationship with the woman who might never end up marrying him after everything that happened. But another part of me, a part I'd been ignoring for years, simply wanted to be seen by someone in that family as more than a problem to be hidden away. I said yes. We met at a small cafe near her office in Dallas, and within 20 minutes, I realized something that genuinely surprised me. Vanessa wasn't just being polite out of guilt. She was curious about me, really curious, in a way Marcus hadn't been in years. What she told me about her own grandmother that afternoon completely changed how I understood everything that had happened that night. My grandmother used to say you were the only person who ever really listened to her after the stroke, Vanessa told me, stirring her coffee slowly. Everyone else talked at her, like she couldn't understand anymore. You talked to her. She told my whole family that before she passed more than once. I hadn't known that. Eleanor had never told me directly, though looking back, I remembered the way her eyes used to light up whenever I walked into that room. If you've ever found out after the fact that something small you did meant far more to someone than you realized at the time, you understand exactly what that lunch felt like for me. It was the strangest, most unexpected comfort, discovering that the work I'd quietly done years earlier, the work my own son had been ashamed of, had actually mattered deeply to the very family whose approval he'd been so desperate to earn through lies instead of honesty. Vanessa and I started meeting regularly after that every few weeks, completely separate from whatever was happening between her and Marcus. She told me about her work, her own complicated family history, and slowly, carefully, about her doubts regarding the man she'd been planning to marry. Meanwhile, Marcus was doing the work too, in his own way. Therapy sessions twice a week, calls to me that actually lasted longer than 5 minutes, real questions about my life instead of rushed updates about his. It wasn't a straight line of progress, not even close. There were setbacks, awkward silences, moments where old patterns crept back in without either of us noticing right away. But for the first time in years, we were actually trying, both of us, instead of letting distance quietly do the work that honesty should have been doing all along. What happened 3 months later, though, none of us expected, not even me. 3 months after that disastrous engagement party, Marcus asked if he could come visit me in Tulsa. Not for a holiday, not for an obligation, just to visit. The way he used to when he was younger, and the world felt simpler between us. I almost cried when he asked. He drove the 3 hours himself this time, the same drive I'd made so many times to see him over the years, and when he walked through my front door, he stopped and looked around the small ranch house like he was seeing it for the first time in a long while. "I forgot how much I loved this house," he said quietly. I didn't know what to say to that, so I simply made coffee, the same way I used to when he was a teenager doing homework at this same kitchen table. What he told me that afternoon explained something I'd been wondering about ever since that night. Exactly what his colleagues at the firm thought of everything that had happened. Some of them stopped talking to me after that night, Marcus admitted, staring into his coffee cup instead of at me. A few partners pulled back on cases they'd promised me. Word travels fast in that world. Asked him if that bothered him more than what he'd actually done to me. He was quiet for a long moment before answering honestly. "At first, yeah, it did," he said. "I'm not proud of that. But the longer I sat with everything, the more I realized those people pulling away said more about them than it did about you. The ones who mattered stayed. The ones who only cared about appearances left. That taught me something I should have already known. If you've ever watched someone slowly relearn a lesson they should have understood their whole life, you know how strange and hopeful that process can feel to witness up close." What happened with Vanessa's father next surprised even Marcus. Vanessa's father, the man who had spoken so firmly to Marcus that night at the party, reached out to him directly a few weeks later, not to lecture him further, but to offer him something unexpected. He told Marcus about his own mother, the one who'd cleaned hotel rooms for the very chain he now owned, and how it had taken him years to stop hiding that part of his own story from people he wanted to impress. "I almost lost myself the same way you almost lost yourself," he told Marcus. "The difference is somebody caught me before it cost me everything that actually mattered." It was, in its own strange way, exactly the kind of mentorship Marcus had been chasing his whole career, except it came wrapped in a lesson about honesty rather than ambition. If you've ever received unexpected grace from someone who had every right to walk away from you instead, you understand how much that moment meant to my son. Around the 6-month mark, Vanessa told Marcus she was ready to talk seriously about the wedding again, but only under one condition. She wanted a real ceremony this time, one where I wasn't introduced as an afterthought or hidden in a back corner, but stood proudly beside my son the way any mother should at her child's wedding. Marcus agreed immediately, without hesitation, in a way that told me he genuinely meant it this time. I'll admit, I cried when he told me over the phone. Not because of the wedding itself, but because of what it represented, proof that the work we'd both been doing separately and together over those 6 months had actually meant something real. If you've ever watched a relationship slowly rebuild itself after being completely shattered, you know it doesn't happen overnight, and it definitely doesn't happen without real, consistent effort from both sides involved. The new wedding date was set for the following spring, nearly a year after that disastrous night in the Dallas ballroom. This time, the planning looked completely different. Marcus called me regularly to ask my opinion on details, flowers, the guest list, even the seating chart, small things that meant something much bigger than themselves. Vanessa insisted I help choose the venue alongside her, something she told me felt important after everything that had happened the first time around. I drove down to Dallas more often that year than I had in the previous 5 combined, and each visit felt a little less like an obligation, and a little more like something I genuinely looked forward to. If you've ever rebuilt a relationship one small visit at a time, You know exactly how meaningful those ordinary moments become after everything that's been broken and slowly repaired between two people. About 2 months before the new wedding date, Marcus asked me something that completely caught me off guard. He wanted to know if I'd be willing to say a few words during the reception, not as an afterthought, but as an actual part of the program, standing at the microphone where his colleagues, Vanessa's family, and everyone who had witnessed that humiliating night a year earlier would now hear directly from me. My first instinct was to say no. The thought of standing in front of that same crowd again made my stomach tighten instantly. But Marcus insisted, telling me it mattered to him that the room that had witnessed him deny me would also witness him publicly, proudly, claim me as his mother in front of everyone. I agreed, nervously, not fully knowing what I would even say when that moment finally arrived. What happened on that actual wedding day, though, exceeded anything I could have imagined. The wedding day arrived faster than I expected, and I'll admit, walking back into that same hotel for the rehearsal the night before brought back every uncomfortable memory from a year earlier. But this time felt different from the moment I walked through the doors. Vanessa met me at the entrance herself, pulling me into a hug before I'd even said a word. "I wanted you here first," she said, "before anyone else." Marcus stood a few feet away, watching us, something soft and grateful in his expression that I hadn't seen from him in years. If you've ever returned to a place that once hurt you and found it transformed into something completely different, you understand exactly what walking into that ballroom felt like for me that evening. The actual ceremony the next day was beautiful, simple, and exactly what both of them wanted. But it was the reception that I want to tell you about next. During the reception, after the formal toasts from the best man and maid of honor, Marcus walked over to the microphone himself and asked everyone for their attention. The room quieted, and I felt my heart pounding as I realized what was about to happen. "A year ago, in this exact room," he began, his voice steady despite the obvious emotion behind it, "I said something about my mother that I will regret for the rest of my life." You could have heard a pin drop. Several guests who had been at that first engagement party exchanged glances, clearly remembering exactly what he was referring to without him needing to explain further. "I called her just the maid," he continued, "because I was ashamed of the sacrifices she made for me. Tonight, I want to correct that, in front of everyone who heard me say it the first time. What he said next is something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. This is my mother, Carol Whitfield," he said, gesturing toward me as I stood near the edge of the room, my eyes already filling with tears. "She raised me alone, working 2 jobs, cleaning houses to put food on our table and eventually pay for my education. Everything I've ever accomplished exists because of sacrifices she made that I spent years too ashamed to acknowledge publicly. That ends tonight." The room erupted into applause, genuine applause this time, completely different from the awkward laughter that had filled that same space a year earlier. Vanessa's father stood up first, clapping the loudest, a proud smile on his face that told me he remembered exactly what he'd said to Marcus that very first night. If you've ever watched someone publicly correct a mistake they once made privately, you know how powerful that kind of accountability can feel to witness, especially when it happens in the exact place the original mistake occurred. Marcus then asked me to come up and say a few words myself, the moment I'd been nervous about for 2 months leading up to that day. I walked to the microphone slowly, my legs shaking slightly, and looked out at the same room that had once watched my son deny my existence. "A year ago, I stood in this room and heard my son call me the maid. I began, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. Tonight, I'm standing here as his mother, watching him marry a woman who taught him something I'd been trying to teach him his entire life, that there's no shame in honest work, and there's no shame in where you come from." I could see Vanessa crying in the front row, her father's hand resting gently on her shoulder. What I said in the final part of that speech is something I want every parent watching this video to hear clearly. I didn't clean houses so my son could hide that fact, I told the room. I cleaned houses so he'd have choices I never had. Tonight, watching him stand here and choose honesty over image, choose accountability over comfort, I finally understand that the lesson actually landed, even if it took a painful year to fully sink in. I looked directly at Marcus as I said it, and I watched him wipe his eyes openly, not caring who saw him do it. The applause that followed lasted longer than I expected, and several guests later told me it was the most genuine moment of the entire wedding. If you've ever waited years for someone to fully understand a lesson you've been trying to teach them, you know exactly how that applause felt rolling over me in that moment, like vindication, relief, and pride all arriving at once after a year that had tested every part of our relationship. After the speeches, Vanessa found me near the edge of the dance floor and pulled me into another hug, longer this time. "Thank you for giving him a second chance," she said quietly. "Most people wouldn't have." I told her honestly that it wasn't really about giving him a second chance out of obligation. It was about watching him actually earn one through real, consistent effort over an entire year, instead of expecting forgiveness simply because we shared blood. That distinction matters more than people realize, and if you're someone currently deciding whether to forgive someone who hurt you, I hope that distinction helps you the way it helped me work through everything that had happened. The rest of the evening passed in a warm blur of dancing, conversation, and a kind of belonging in that family I never expected to feel after the way that first night had gone a year earlier. Looking back on everything now, I think about how close I came to simply absorbing that humiliation quietly the way I had absorbed so many smaller slights over the years before it. If I had stayed silent that night, if I had let Marcus's comment slide the way I'd let so many things slide before, none of what followed would have happened. The accountability, the honest conversations, the rebuilt relationship, none of it would exist if I hadn't finally decided that one moment mattered enough to address directly instead of quietly swallowing the hurt like I always had before. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's that speaking up for yourself, especially with the people closest to you, isn't selfish or dramatic. Sometimes it's the only thing that actually creates the space for real change to happen at all between two people who genuinely love each other but have lost their way. Marcus and I talk every week now, real conversations, the kind we used to have when he was younger, and the world felt simpler between us. He still works in Dallas, still climbing in his career, but he talks about his work differently now. He mentions me proudly to colleagues instead of avoiding the topic entirely. A few months ago, he told a new associate at his firm, completely unprompted, that his mother taught him everything he knows about hard work, the exact same way he used to tell his middle school teacher all those years ago. Hearing that came full circle in a way I didn't expect to feel so deeply. If you've ever watched someone return to the person they used to be before shame or ambition pulled them away from themselves, you understand exactly how meaningful that small comment meant to me, more than any grand gesture ever could have. Vanessa and I still have lunch regularly, separate from Marcus, a tradition that started out of an awkward apology and grew into something I genuinely treasure now. She told me recently that she's grateful for how everything unfolded, painful as it was, because it forced both her and Marcus to build their marriage on something real instead of the carefully managed image he'd been hiding behind for years before they ever met. I think about that often, how sometimes the most painful moments in our lives end up clearing space for something far more honest and lasting than what came before them. If this story resonated with you, even a little, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below, because stories like this only matter if they actually help someone else recognize patterns in their own life before it's too late to address them honestly. I still drive to Dallas regularly now, sometimes for visits, sometimes just because I want to. The drive doesn't feel heavy anymore the way it used to in those years when I'd arrive only to be quietly tolerated rather than genuinely welcomed. Last month, Marcus and Vanessa announced they're expecting their first child, and Marcus asked me, without hesitation, if I'd be willing to help out the way I once helped raise him, not as hired help, but as a grandmother, fully present in every sense of the word. I cried for an hour after that phone call, not from sadness this time, but from a kind of relief that's hard to put into words unless you've lived through something similar yourself. If you've made it this far in the story, thank you for staying with me through all of it, because what I want to leave you with in this final part might be the most important thing I've said yet. If there's one thing I hope you carry away from everything I've shared, it's this. The people who truly love you will eventually choose honesty over comfort, even when it's hard, even when it costs them something in the moment. It might not happen immediately. It might take a painful, public moment like the one I lived through to finally force that choice into the open. But real change is possible, even after deep betrayal. If both people are willing to do the harder work that honesty actually requires instead of simply hoping time will quietly fix what words once broke. To everyone watching who has ever felt hidden, diminished, or unseen by someone you sacrificed everything for, your story isn't over, and neither was mine. If this video meant something to you, please subscribe, leave a comment telling me your own story, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for staying until the very end.